the major bank, so the major banks are share companies, and they are owned by shareholders, of course, and the aim is to maximize profits. The saving banks are owned by local authorities, municipalities, and they are not profit maximizing, but they are cost covering. They have a strategy of cost covering. And we have cooperative banks. They are owned by members, and these banks are also not profit maximizing. They are also cost covering. So these are the three big pillars. Then what's wrong? So let's look at the 10 biggest German banks, and this may be a surprise for you when you look at the 10 biggest bank. The by far biggest bank is the Deutsche Bank. That's a private bank. She's, you could say, the only really big international player. And then we have a number of banks. All these banks, most of these banks are not private owned. This bank is owned by, this is a central bank of the cooperative banks, the KfW Group. This bank is a German development bank owned by basically the central government. So our third biggest bank is a state-owned development bank. This is a private bank, number 4. Number 5 is also a private bank. Number 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. These are banks which are partly owned by saving banks and partly owned by government. As you can see here, we have really a mix of ownership, and a big part of the banking system is owned by local communities or government institutions, or in case of cooperative banks, by members. This also becomes clear when you, this is from 2017, when you look which banks give loans to the company sector. Here we have the private banks, the private banks owned by private persons, stock companies. Here we have the saving banks, and here we have the cooperative banks and Landesbanken here. These are also owned by government and saving banks together. I will discuss this later in detail. So what you can see, really a big part of credits given in Germany comes from institutions which are not private owned. So we have really a huge government influence, if you like, in the German financial system. I will not go into detail. You can look at this later, at the market shares of the different pillars of the German system. When we look at the total assets, not the credits given, but the total assets, we have here the private banks have a share of 40%, saving banks 26%, cooperative banks 18%, and the other banks, including the big development bank, 16%. But now let's look at the at the role of the different segments of the German financial system. Let's start with the big private banks. And it's pretty clear the big private banks finance the big German companies. So we have a division of labor, if you like, so that the big banks finance the big German companies. And what we have here is a so-called house bank principle. So each company, this is also for small companies, each company has a major bank as a partner, and there's a lot of information flow between the bank and the firm. And there's a relationship, if you like, based on trust. To a certain extent, we have a model like it was analyzed by Josef Schumpeter. The bank in a certain way supervises the firm. The bank controls the firm. So if a firm wants to invest something, it has to present to the banker what it wants to do, and then the bank decides whether the credit is given or not. Because of this trustful relationship, the German banking system also helps companies in problems to survive in situations of problem, let's say in a financial crisis. This system, the big private banks financing the big companies, was called so-called share company model Deutschland. So as you could say, as whole Germany would be a kind of stock company. That's the meaning. What is meant? The idea of this expression is that there were really very close relationship among the big private banks and also insurance companies, and between the big private banks and companies. For example, banks kept high percentages of shares from companies. So banks were not only giving credit, they also kept equity in big companies. So we had a network in which companies owned shares from other companies. Big financial institutions kept shares from other big financial institutions, and financial institutions kept large percentages of equity of the big companies. And this is the ownership structure in 1996. And the yellow arrows are relationships between big companies within the financial system. The red arrows are relationships between companies, and the orange arrows are ownership relationships between financial institutions and companies. So we had really a kind of very close network, which included bankers and companies. And in the 50s and 60s, as you can see, until the 1990s, this was extremely successful system to improve productivity, to finance big companies, and also create GDP growth. This system was has been partly dissolved until today. What happened? The German banks and German firms wanted to become global players, so they did not want to be any longer be within this German network. They want to become global, and also politics. The government very much pushed German banks and also companies to become more global, and also foreign companies entered Germany, not too many, but some, and some big companies, and this close network became a little bit more loose. So the network is still existing, but as you can see here, it's not that close any longer. So to sum up, the big private banks mainly finance big German companies or companies in Germany. They have close relationships until today. Two companies. The companies have a so-called house bank, and there's a trustful relationship. And this means that usually big banks give big companies have no problem to get sufficient credit, because the big private banks will finance the big companies. At the same time, we have a tendency that financial institutions and also German companies try to become global players. Okay, this is now this private sector financial system. Let's come to the saving banks. That might be an interesting system also for some developing countries. And actually, the system has the following structure. We have 12, you could say, relatively independent networks of saving banks. And in 12 regions, so to say, in 12 regions, we have independent saving banks. In each region, we have many small local saving banks. I think around 8,000 branches in all sectors. So we have many small saving banks owned by local community or local communities. So Berlin, for example, has a big saving bank, but also when you go to the countryside, small cities or counties would have a saving bank owned by the local by the local households, by local government. And as mentioned, these banks were not profit oriented. They had to serve the regional economy. These saving banks in one of the regions are owners of the so-called state banks, In many cases, also the state government owns part of these banks. So these are big banks, partly owned by the smaller saving banks and partly owned by the state government, not the federal government, but the state government. And the purpose of these banks is to finance big infrastructure projects, basically government infrastructure projects. And also these banks serve the smaller banks, the smaller saving banks. And then we have one institution of all the smaller saving banks. This is a special bank, a national bank owned by the saving banks, especially for investment banking, because these local banks, saving banks, are not allowed to carry out investment banking. They are not allowed to invest internationally. These state banks were partly not so good managed. So in the crisis 2008, they made a lot of losses because these banks speculated in international markets as the private banks did. So these banks were completely stable. We are not affected by the big financial crisis 2008, but some of these banks, not all, also speculated abroad because they were allowed to do that and realized big losses. So these saving banks have a long history. They were founded by local communities in the 19th century. What is very important, we have this local principle. That means a saving bank is not only allowed to make business in the region it is responsible for. So savings banks cannot compete with each other, if you like. Yeah, so we have, let's say, the saving bank Berlin. It only is allowed to give credit to companies or private households or other institutions in Berlin. It cannot give credit to units outside Berlin, for example. So this local principle forces the banks to support the local industry. And actually, the saving banks are key financiers for small and medium-sized companies. So when you look, the big private banks finance the big companies, the saving banks finance the small and medium-sized companies, and they serve the small and medium-sized companies really in a really good way. If, let's say, in one region, a saving bank has too much liquidity, it cannot find good debtors, then it can transfer that to the central institution, and other saving banks then can give more credit, but the saving bank itself is not allowed to go to other regions to give credit. So saving banks really support the regional economy, small and medium-sized enterprises. Also here we have the house bank principle that also smaller companies have the saving bank as a main partner, and there's a lot of information flow between the bank and the firm. Let's come to the collectively owned banks. The collectively owned banks are owned by the members. In the first phase, so in the history, these collectively owned banks only were allowed to give credit or make business with members, but this is not the case any longer. These collectively owned banks can also make business with non-members, and actually they also follow the regional principle. The collectively owned banks are only allowed to give credit within the region, so the structure is almost identical to the saving bank, except the ownership. So I don't need to go into more details when we look at collectively owned banks. To sum up this part, these saving banks and collectively owned banks are really very, very important for rural areas. They were important for small or medium-sized companies also in big cities, and they are important to develop the local economy. And the experiences with these banks are really, really very good. They are managed in a good way. We have many, many local communities responsible for their saving bank, and there are almost no cases of mismanagement or something like that. So they're really managed in a good way, and they support the local community, the region. So that's one of the important pillars also for the German economy, because the German economy is dominated by small and medium-sized companies, which play really a big role also in the high-tech sector. So we have many, many hidden champions, as it is called. Now let's come to the third biggest German bank, the German Development Bank, KfW. This bank was established after World War II, and it was established together with United States. The purpose was to finance German companies to develop West Germany. So it goes back to the so-called Marshall Plan. That was a plan. That was a plan. Yeah. Everything fine? Okay, so this bank was established after World War II to help West Germany to develop. It is owned by the federal government to 80% and the German states, the different states, by 20%. And it's really a big bank. And in 2020, it has a balance sheet of 16% of the German GDP. So that's really a big bank. And it's not so many people know that Germany has such a big and important development bank. This development bank usually gives credit together with saving banks or with private banks. So the typical procedure is there is let's say, a government program to support digitalization, let's say. Then small companies, bigger companies, medium-sized companies can apply to get subsidized credit. Then they go to their saving bank, to their house bank, and they apply for that. And then this house bank gives credit together with the development bank. So let's say the saving bank then shows the development bank, okay, here's a company, this company has a project in digitalization, it's fulfilling all the criteria, we would like to give credit. Okay, 50% of the credit probably is given by the saving bank or by the private bank, 50% by the development bank. So this big development bank has not a own big branch network. This is done by saving banks, collectively owned banks, or private banks. This development bank is also allowed to become partly owner of firms, so it can also keep equity, for example, in case of startups. what is very important. So it takes over also the function of venture capital, and this big bank is one of the major channel of the German industrial policy. For example, when Germany decided to give up nuclear power stations and also to give up producing energy via coal, wind energy became very important, and this development bank was a major financing institutions to build up capacities in the area of alternative energy production. So this bank really plays important role. Here we have different activities. This bank is also supporting foreign countries. It also has a development branch, if you like. I do not want to go into details here. You can look it up later. And this is the main activities, is domestic activities, and these are different purposes, different activities by this development bank. And you can see, I just want to mention two. This big blue, this is support of companies, so credit given to companies, and this green here, this is a huge part of the credits given for energy transition. So you can see here this development bank plays a key role in transforming the German energy system. And also, as you may know, yesterday we became a new government in Germany, a new government, and this new government has the aim of green transition, really changing fundamentally the energy system, and this German Development Bank plays a big role, should play a big role in the plan to transform the German energy system. I come to the conclusion for developing countries. So this is my interpretation, but also what I've learned from many visits in developing countries. So what can developing countries learn from this German banking system? First, I think it shows that a bank-based system, a bank-based financial system can be very successful. So in the Western world, we have, if you like, two big types of financial system. The bank-based system, Germany is a very typical case. And we have the so-called capital-based system. Typical case is here United States or Great Britain. In the capital-based system, stock markets play a bigger role. But also, what is sometimes forgotten, in this capital-based systems, banks also play, of course, a very, very, very important role. But in Germany, we have this bank-based system. And in my opinion, developing countries more or less have only the option to build up and support a bank-based system. Of course, stock markets can also play a role in developing countries. However, to concentrate in a developing country the financial system on stock markets, or debt securities issued by big private companies, I think this really does not work. At least I don't know any country, any developing country, which used stock markets and debt securities as a key element of its financial markets. And I think this also can be explained that in the typical developing country, stock markets do not work very well. First, they used to be even more speculative than in the developed world. And also in the developed world, stock markets are very speculative. A big problem in the typical developing country is there's a lot of insider trading. That means people with good knowledge, better knowledge than others, exploit their knowledge. So we have this unfair trading, if you like. And also the corporate control via stock markets. So that means that shareholders control the management. This is even problematic in developed countries, but it usually does not work in developing countries. So the share price as a main measure for the performance of management in the typical developing country, this does not work. So we have good arguments that developing countries should build up sound bank-based financial systems, giving the stock market a certain role, also debt securities a certain role, but it would be an illusion, in my opinion, to build a financial system in developing countries mainly on stock markets and debt securities. This is a first conclusion I draw, also from the German experience, because in Germany, the stock market did not play an important role. It was a banking system. Second important point, development banks are needed. Especially in developing countries, development banks are needed. So you need a banking institution which channels credit in sectors which should be supported, according to government decisions. Of course, such a development bank should check whether credits can be paid back, so there should be no soft credits, but development bank is important. In many cases, also private bank don't like the risk to finance certain activities. So also for that purpose, development banks are needed. Also, small or medium-sized companies need finance. Usually, private banks don't give sufficient credit to small or medium-sized companies. Also here, development banks can play a role. And what I would like to stress is there's a big debate about microfinance. Microfinance has the purpose to fight against poverty and has the purpose to smooth consumption. This is fine, but what development banks should do, they should support the strong small and medium-sized enterprises, the innovative small and medium-sized enterprise. So this is a little bit different to microfinance. What Germany shows is that a mixed ownership in financial systems can bring very good results. That also developing countries could think about that, whether this mixed ownership could be a model. These saving banks owned by local governments in Germany are a very successful model. Also, cooperative banks can be considered to be successful. And what we can learn when we look at the last decades, these local saving banks, these local cooperative banks were not allowed to enter investment banking. They were not allowed to speculate on share markets. They were not allowed to invest abroad, and they remained very, very stable. The big banks came into trouble when big financial crisis happened. These small banks were very, very stable. And let me last point, for the typical developing country, the financial system should not be global. The main purpose should be really to finance domestic development. And in my opinion, also certain capital controls are needed for developing countries to create a stable system. Financial system in East Asian miracle countries and also China can serve as successful cases. They are not identical with the German system, but also they are mainly a bank-based system. They are also regulated, and also development banks played a big role, for example, in South Korea or Taiwan or China mainland until today. If I would be a researcher in Laos, I would look at different countries, what kind of financial systems worked in developed countries, for example, Germany or other countries. And I also would look what was done in East Asian miracle countries, how managed these countries to catch up on what kind of financial systems they used. I have two literature sources. I've written in 2017 a big book in English with a whole group of researchers about the German financial system, and a smaller paper about global value chains and development and the role of development banks. I think you can use these sources. I'm sure you will get these sources. They are in electronic version, and here you can read some of the ideas I have developed. So thank you very much, and I hope we will have a nice and open debate.
Professor Dr. Herr ที่ได้ให้การเสนออย่างกว้างขวางเกี่ยวกับบทบาทสินเชื่อต่อการพัฒนาเศรษฐกิจของสหพันธ์เยอรมันท่านยังได้ให้ความรู้เกี่ยวกับระบบการเงินของเยอรมันให้แก่พวกเขานักสมรรถกรรับทราบการเสนอของท่านถือว่าเป็นบทเรียนอันล้ำค่าให้แก่พวกเขาฉะนั้นต่อไปเพื่อว่าเป็นโอกาสให้แก่นักสมรรถกรให้ได้ประกอบความเห็นหรือว่าตั้งคำถามต่อท่านข้าพเจ้าขอเปิดฟลอร์ให้แก่ทุกท่านมีคำถามเนาะขอเชิญบรรดาท่านนักสมรรถกรผู้ใดที่มีคำถามเป็นเชิญขอให้พวกท่านยกมือเนาะอยู่ในแอปซูมมันจะมีกดเข้าไปอยู่บน3ปุ่มฮะแล้วมันจะมีบนยกมือฮะให้ท่านยกมือเพื่อให้ทางเทคนิคทางวิชาการเพิ่นได้เปิดไมค์ให้ท่านเนาะเจ้าขอเชิญ ชิญท่านใดสิมีคำเห็นก็ได้หรือว่ามีคำถามก็ได้เจ้ามื้อนี้นักสมณกรพวกเฮาทั้งเบิดที่เข้าร่วมมี73ท่านเนาะแต่ว่าลงทะเบียนตัวจริงผ่านออนไลน์มีแต่52ท่านฉะนั้นเพื่อความสะดวกในการออกใบยั่งยืนการเข้าร่วมของประชุมเสนอต่อบรรดาท่านผู้ที่บ่ทันได้ลงทะเบียนก็สามารถลงทะเบียนย้อนกลับหลังได้เพื่อพวกเขาจะมีข้อมูลในการออกเนาะสนาระยะรอท่านนี่จะมีท่านใดอยากตั้งคำถามก่อนขอเชิญเราเด้อเชิญท่านยกมือขึ้นเลยทั้ง
Yes, thank you very much for your interesting presentation, Professor. Let me introduce myself. I'm Kinalon Pimawong from the Center for Macro Economic Research. I have a few questions to you, Professor. Yeah, I would like to know, would like to ask for your opinion or your perspective about the financial system in Laos. Currently, we are bank-based financial system, but the majority of banks are foreign banks and foreign affiliates. So, in your perspective, do you think this is now is around 44 banks in Laos? Do you think that it is suitable for Laos if compared to the size of the Lao economy? Another question is saving banks. I may miss I may not be able to catch up your presentation the total context of your presentation about saving banks. Is that these saving banks mobilize small savings from community and to tap the money and transfer to the institute, one institute, and then this institute will be the institute is the function of this institute is to collect money from those saving banks and to provide the credits to long-term investments or the infrastructure investment. Another question is, we also have the microfinance institutes in Laos, including those saving groups in local communities operated by the head of communities or the women's unions in the local communities. However, in recent years, the numbers of these financial microfinance institutes as well as the saving groups have declined, especially those saving groups due to mismanagement. And for the microfinance, the registered microfinance institutes declined from more than 140 institutes registered with the in the banks of Lao PDR. Currently, is around the numbers of registered microfinance institute is around 70 something institutes. The problem is that these microfinance facilitate credit access to the small and medium enterprise as well as for household smoothing consumption. But the problem is the interest rate even recently has declined, but still very high. the loan credits approximately 30% per year. It's around 2.5% per month. So such rate, though it declined, before it was much higher than these rates. So do you think this can help the small and micro SME or even the poor household? And because you did not mention about the interest rate, and we have the quite similar features to the Germany in the past about this microfinance. And another thing is the problem is our problem is currently the private banks, yes, try to finance the SME. However, recently those banks are reluctant to provide loans to the SME due to the high NPL in the past. And in this case, I would like to know that whether Germany in the past used to have this similar experience or not, and what the solution to help the access to finance. And one last question is the credit, yes, financing for to stimulate economic growth. Yes, we need financing, but the government set the target ceiling credit growth currently is around 20% per annum. So do you think this is I just want to know your opinion whether this is suitable or not, or should be lower than this or should be higher than this. But if you see in the real economy, the credit growth in recent years has declined from in the past more than 20%, more than 25%, and currently has a trend declining trend. Last year, around less than 10%, around 5 or 6%. I'm sorry, I cannot remember the actual figures. So in the situation that we need to, we still the government also set the I'll say the high kind of aim high to set the higher target growth of the GDP, but in the same time also set the ceiling for credit growth. So thank you very much, and sorry for the too many questions with you. Thank you.
Should I directly answer?
Professor, Ms. Kinalon have 5 questions. It's depend on yourself. Mr. Sumjit also raised a hand and want to ask some question. Maybe you want to answer Ms. Kinalon first, and then next step, Mr. Sumjit can ask you again.
Okay.
Or you want to collect? Or you
No,
want to collect question?
Yeah, I can answer. I can answer the questions.
Okay.
So thank you very much for this very good questions. First, foreign banks. I think if a financial system is dominated by foreign banks, this is not good. This is very bad. And you already mentioned the key point foreign banks don't tend to finance small and medium-sized enterprises. They only like to finance the big enterprises in the country. This is, by the way, an argument by Nobel Prize winner Joseph Stiglitz. So he argued countries should be very cautious with foreign banks. A second argument is, which makes foreign banks critical, first, profits of these banks flow out. Yeah, I mean, the owners are abroad and profits are transferred out. That's not so nice for a country. And finally, in case the capital flows are not regulated, to have an open capital account, foreign banks tend to collect hard currency, let's say dollars or whatever, and transfer them abroad and don't use them for domestic credit. So foreign banks could play a certain positive role, but if the domestic system is dominated by foreign banks, I think there are theoretical as well as empirical arguments that this is not an ideal case, that a mixture of ownership would be better. The next question, saving banks. Yes, you're right. I've not mentioned that. The local saving banks collect the savings in the region. They are the main collectors for private households and also for firms. They collect the savings and use the savings also to give credit. That's also an important function. They have a really very a very good branch system and can collect deposits and give credit to saving banks as well as collectively owned banks. The saving banks are, I must say, very, very good managed. And I think two points play a role here. They are managed or controlled. The managers of these banks are controlled by local government and at the same time by the state bank. So we have this double control. So we have the central institution of this many small saving banks. This central institution is also controlling. So we have this double control, and in the case of collectively owned banks, we have the same logic, and this seems to work. There was never a kind of big general crisis, or these banks are much better in avoiding non-performing loans than the big private banks. Microfinance, yes, I'm not such a great fan of microfinance, especially if the interest rates are so high. And Laos is only one of the examples. I mean, to be clear, if let's say the real interest rate is 25% or something like that, or even higher, the money cannot be used for investment. That's simply not possible. So that's to create a dynamic is not possible. I think Laos should search for finance opportunities with low real interest rates, and yeah, in Germany, we had this established saving banking system, and this really is fulfilling a very good job for low interest rates. The interest rates are very, very low. Of course, we had also phases of restrictive monetary policy when the central bank is fighting against inflation. We had real interest rates, let's say 4, 5, 6%, but never higher. Usually the interest rates are very low. These saving banks, of course, also work very cost efficient. So yeah, there's no reason to have this high interest rates. And I agree, one of the major shortcomings of microfinance is this very, very, very high interest rates. And that means microfinance cannot serve the purpose to finance investment on a local level. And this is, of course, for development, very, very important. With credit ceilings, of course, to judge this, one would have to look at the macroeconomic situation in Laos. One would have to look in which sectors is the credit flowing. Is it in the real estate sector? Is there a bubble? Is it flowing to private households and this become over indebted? Basically, for a certain development stage, I'm a fan of credit rationing systems. Keeps the interest low. It keeps the interest low and use the credit ceiling system. I'm a fan of such a system. But to judge whether this is too much or not too much, I would have to know the situation in Laos, and I don't know that. And you may know Japan, for example, had this very simple credit rationing. South Korea had it. Many countries, China had it for a long time, and that's I think a suitable system. But of course, the interest rates should not be too high. Okay, I hope I could touch everything.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor, for your answer.
Oh, sorry, no voice. But บ่มีเสียงเลยท่านบ่ได้ยินเสียงเลยฮัลโหลได้ยินอยู่อาจารย์สมจิต
เมื่อกี้อาจารย์เปิดได้ยินแล้วเด้อเซิร์ชเปิดไมค์อีกทีนึง
ฮัลโหล
เจ้าได้ยิน
ได้ยินแล้วบ่โอเคต่อไปมันที่ของภายนอก
ที่ของอาจารย์สมจิตเจ้าเชิญ
โอ้ขอบใจบ่ได้ยินเสียงท่านเลย Oh, thank you very much, Professor Herr, for your best presentation today. Yeah, I have 3 questions to you, but the second question, Dr. Kinalon asked you already, and I got your very good answer. But the first question that I would like to pose to you, I heard that in your presentation you said that in Germany you have 3 kinds of banking, right? The first one is private banks, the second one is state-owned banks, and the third one is cooperative bank. I would like to ask you that which one is the more effective than others between private banks, state-owned banks, and cooperative banks. I ask you like this because in Laos, in the past time, we have a lot of problems that occur with the state-owned banks, and now the government try to privatize the banks. So which one is the more effective than others? The first one is like that. The second one, Dr. Kinalon already asked you, and the third one I would like to ask you that in your presentation you said that in developing countries, stock market are very unstable, usually very unstable. So the question that I would like to ask you, do you have some policy or some ways to solve this problem, especially how to stable the stock market in the developing countries? Thank you very much. I asked a very short question like this. Thank you, Professor.
ขอบใจอาจารย์สมจิตเจ้าเชิญท่านศาสตราจารย์ดร. Herr.
Yeah, thank you very much for also these very good questions. The first question, these 3 pillars of the German financial system, and as I've told you, the state-owned pillar and collectively owned pillar is even the bigger pillar than the private pillar. Actually, it may sound strange, but this state-owned sector and the collectively owned sector were much more stable than the private sector and the private pillar. And why is this the case? And obviously, this local ownership is very, very important. That we don't have the bank owned by the central government, so we have this very decentralized ownership, and this decentralized ownership, together with the control from the central institution of the saving banks, obviously led to a very good management, and actually in Germany at least it worked, that these state-owned banks owned by local communities did a very, very good job. They were also profitable. They were also, when you look at efficiency, they were as efficient as the private banks. The same is for the collectively owned. What is the problem with the big private banks in Germany? And also part of the big state banks, so the central institutions. These institutions, the state banks and also the private banks, these institutions invested a lot abroad. They took part in the speculative activities before 2008, and this led to the result that these banks realized a lot of losses. Actually, after 2008, the German government had to spend huge sums of money to save the big private banks and the big state banks. So we have this puzzling outcome that these local banks owned by local governments were very stable, and the big banks going abroad, speculating in US and all over the world, realized a lot of losses. I think the explanation is the big banks in Germany, including the private banks, were not sufficiently regulated, and after 2008, 2009, a new wave of regulation came. So Basel II was substituted by Basel III, for example, and but there's now a big debate: are the regulations now sufficient or not? So to sum up, in Germany, we managed that there was no corruption when we look at these saving banks and collectively owned banks. The next question, the role of stock markets. My recommendation would be, of course, you should allow stock markets, and you should also accept stock markets. And if companies want to issue shares and somebody would like to buy them, okay. But I would isolate the stock markets from the rest of the financial system. So, so to say, this was, by the way, the logic of in Germany also in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Let's say what happened in the stock market did not have any big repercussion for the rest of the economy. And people who would like to speculate, or people who would like to engage in stock market, let them do that. So you should make sure that speculation on stock markets is not done with credit. Yeah, because then it becomes dangerous if people take credit and speculate. So make sure that speculation does not take speculation is not financed by credit. And second, that stock market development is relatively unimportant for companies. This was the old system in Germany. You know, nobody cared whether the share price was high or low. It had no any repercussion. It only became important when new shares should be issued, and we also should be clear about that. To issue new shares can play a role for financing investment, but it plays a very, very small role. Even in the United States, to issue new shares is not important to finance companies. It only plays a very small role. Actually, in the United States, since many years, more shares are bought back by companies than new shares issued. Yeah, and it can play a role in certain situations, and this can be used also by developing countries. But isolate the stock market, that instability in the stock market has no repercussion for the rest of the financial system. It's a little bit what China is doing. You know, stock markets go up and down, but people lose and win money, and that I would say is a way you could go.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much, Professor. Yeah, thank you for your answer.
'Yeah. It is okay that I would like to ask question.
Please, please.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor. First, I would like to introduce myself. My name is Person Sangsulivong. I'm from National University of Laos. I have two questions. For the first one, based on your PowerPoint or your presentation, you said that the private sector seem to be have more power based on the financial in Germany. So I just would like to ask your experience that, because if you know already, the private sector have more powerful based on the assets that they have in the bank. So if the German government would like to implementation, for example, like when you have the economic contraction, so they would like to implement of the monetary policy. How can they convince the private sector? Because actually the objective of private sector is mean private bank is opposite of the aim of the government to implementation of the policy. This is the first one. And the second one, I just curious that, because based on your presentation, it seems to be German financial system is totally different with the Chinese financial system. So in Laos, you know already, Laos is small country. We are small economics. So if we apply the FIFO of the financial system, it will be good in the long term or not? Okay, thank you very much.
So please, Professor Dr. please.
Okay, first to the first question, let's come to monetary policy. When we speak about monetary policy, the central bank can implement monetary policy. For example, the central bank can push up the interest rate. This is a main instrument for monetary policy, to restrictive monetary policy, to increase the interest rate, and this can be done by the central bank, and in Germany by the European Central Bank, and the private sector, the private banks cannot do anything about it. So it's very clear if the central bank wants to raise interest rates, and there's no chance that the private banks or the private sector can prevent that. Okay. However, what we clearly see, especially during the last decades, is that the power of the central bank is asymmetric. So, for example, after 2008, the European Central Bank wanted to stimulate the European economy, and in 2014, the interest rates, the refinancing rate became zero. So banks can refinance themselves unlimited for zero interest rate, but the banks did not give credit. So you see, the power of the bank is asymmetric. The central bank wants to push the banks to give credit, but the banks don't want. They don't, especially the big banks don't give credit, and that would be a long own lecture about monetary policy after 2008. However, the situation we have is that central banks created liquidity, huge amounts, wanted to push investment and also banks to finance investment, and this only to a limited extent worked. So the central bank has the power for restrictive monetary policy to slow down the economy, but the central bank has no power or limited power to stimulate the economy. This is the situation we have in Europe. Otherwise, the private sector, of course, has big influence also on the government. And what we have in Germany is we have a system of organizations, employers organizations, trade unions, research institutes, and usually we have an interaction between government and employers associations, and to a certain extent also trade unions, and then economic policy is discussed. The German financial system is of course very different from the Chinese financial system. In the Chinese financial system, you could argue almost, as you may know, 95% of the banks are state-owned at different levels, and also the big banks are state-owned. In Germany, the big banks are private, and what I think is also a big difference to the Chinese system is in China, this model of local banks in the agricultural sector, etc., also did not work very well because there was too much maybe corruption or at least non-performing loans. So I think in my judgment, China did not manage and did also stop to implement something like the German saving bank system or collectively owned system because of non-performing loans. That's also a very big difference. So in Germany, really, these local banks serving the local economy really worked, and there's virtually no corruption, and also it's the sector with the lowest non-performing loans. And then there was a second part in the second question I did not completely understand. Maybe you can ask again.
Yeah, I just would like to ask you that in your opinion, because Laos is a small country, if the government would like to liberalization of the financial system, so it will be good to long-term economic growth or not if we do such kind of that thing, free flow of the financial system.
Okay, thank you. The question is what kind of liberalization? I think I would not recommend, let's say, to open the capital account. I would not think it makes sense to have completely free capital flow between Laos and the rest of the world. This is usually leading to very, very unstable constellations. The problem is if Laos would open the capital account, no capital controls, the danger is that the private sector would become over indebted, maybe the household sector even become over indebted. So this happened in Central and Eastern European countries after the breakdown of the Soviet Union. Many countries took a lot of credit because they opened the capital account. Companies became over indebted, private households became over indebted, and the danger, especially the danger, is if the credits are given in foreign currency and currency mismatch is created. So speaking about the external sector, certain regulations are, in my opinion, necessary. Deregulating the domestic financial system. So in that case, we would have to discuss what should be deregulated. Of course, deregulation to a certain extent of the domestic financial system, that's possible and can be successful, but we would have to discuss what you mean, whether you deregulate determination of interest rates or give up the credit ceiling system or etc. Yeah, that would be another debate.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor.
ขอบใจบรรดาท่านผู้สมณกรพวกเขาก็มีเวลาจำกัดพอสมควรเนาะเดี๋ยวนี้ก็พอดี 4 โมงถือตามแผนวาระกองประชุมที่พวกเขาได้กำหนดไว้ข้าพเจ้าบ่ฮู้ว่ายังมีท่านใดอยากมีคำเห็นหรือว่าอยากมีคำถามบ่ถ้าบ่มีนี่ข้าพเจ้าอยากขออนุญาตถ่ายรูปร่วมกับบรรดาท่าน อยากให้บรรดาท่านเปิดกล้องเพื่อถ่ายรูปร่วมกันเป็นที่ระลึกเนาะแต่ว่าหลังจากเปิดกล้องต้องได้ใจเย็นนิดนึงเพราะว่าเน็ตเฮามันบ่สมบูรณ์แล้วพวกเฮาจะรอท่านิดนึงหลังจากเบิดทุกคนมาอ้อนกองประชุมเทอก่อนพวกเฮาเฮ็ดใหม่โพดและเฮ็ดให้รูปมัว แล้วมื้อนี้มันมีหลายแล้วมื้อนี้หลายเฮาจะได้สไลด์ไปประมาณ3ครั้งเนาะขอให้พวกท่านรอท่าทางฝ่ายเทคนิคขอจัดการเรื่องการถ่ายภาพให้ได้แคปหน้าจอเนาะยังเราถ่ายเนาะเดี๋ยวเราถ่ายนิดนึงพอรูปบ่ทันเต็มเทื่อเชิญประธานเปิดกล้องเนาะเชิญกล้องวิดีโอเดี๋ยวสไลด์ต่อไปบ่เอาหน้ากล้องทวิตนี่ถือว่าใกล้สิเต็มแล้วยังมี 3-4 ทางได้บ่เสิร์ชเอาได้เต็มแล้วเอาเสิร์ชได้บ่พวกน้องบรรดาท่านผู้สมณกรถ้าว่าพวกท่านอยากติดตามกองประชุมคืนพวกเราได้มีการอัดอยู่ YouTube จะได้ลงอยู่ช่อง YouTube ของกองประชุมของพวกเราเนาะพวกเราจะมีการบันทึกบางเทื่อก็เป็นครั้งที่2เทคนิคก็บ่ทันสมบูรณ์ปานใดฉะนั้นบางเทื่อในครั้งต่อไปจะสมบูรณ์ขึ้นหลายกว่าเก่าฉะนั้นในช่วงสุดท้ายนี้ข้าพเจ้าก็บ่มีหยังขอแสดงความขอบใจและผู้บุญคุณต่อท่านศาสตราจารย์ดร.แฮที่ได้ให้บทเรียนเกี่ยวกับเรื่องปัญหาการเงินและสินเชื่อระบบธนาคารของสหพันธ์เยอรมัน ซึ่งเป็นบทเรียนอันล้ำค่าที่ให้นักสมณกรพวกเราได้นำไปเป็นข้อมูลในการค้นคว้าพิจารณาให้แก่กรณีศึกษาของสปป.ลาวดังที่ข้าพเจ้าได้เว้าในเบื้องต้นนั้นกองประชุมพวกเราอยากจะดำเนินไปในครั้งต่อไปนี้พวกเราคาดว่าจะจัดใส่วันที่22ซึ่งว่าพวกเราถ้าว่าทางฝ่ายเวียดนามเพิ่นทันและเพิ่นจะเข้าร่วมเพิ่นจะเสนอเกี่ยวกับปัญหาพื้นฐานเกี่ยวกับเศรษฐกิจตลาดสังคมของสสเวียดนามแล้วพวกเราอาจจะยกเอาปัญหาใดนึงเนาะแน่นอนบรรดาหัวข้อที่ทางพวกเขาคณะจัดตั้งได้เสนอไปให้เป็นการข้อเสนอเบื้องต้นถ้าหากว่าผู้สมณกรหากสนใจหัวข้อใดเป็นพิเศษซึ่งพวกท่านคิดว่ามีความจำเป็นอยาก อยากเข้าใจและอยากแลกเปลี่ยนเป็นพิเศษพวกท่านสามารถเสนอมาทางกองเลขาพวกเราได้พวกเราสามารถซับได้เนาะและนอกจากนั้นพวกเรากำลังเชิญทางศาสตราจารย์จากสป.จีนเนาะสมทบกับท่านศาสตราจารย์ดร.แห่นี้ซึ่งว่าพวกเราก็มีการแลกเปลี่ยนประสานงานสมทบซึ่งกันและกันเนาะข้าพเจ้าคิดว่ากองประชุมในมื้อนี้พวกเราได้เข้าใจบทบาทของสินเชื่อต่อการพัฒนาเศรษฐกิจและพวกเราได้เรียนรู้เกี่ยวกับระบบการเงินของสหพันธ์เยอรมันเนาะซึ่งว่าก็มีหลายอันที่พวกเราจะต้องได้ทอดถอนบทเรียนและก็เป็นบทเรียนอันดีสำหรับสปป.ลาวของพวกเราเป็นต้นแม่นข้าพเจ้าได้สังเกตเห็นว่าปัญหา microfinance ที่มันมีพื้นฐานซึ่งว่ามันจะก้าวไปเป็นสถาบันการเงินของกลุ่มการผลิตและสหกรณ์ในอนาคตนั้นแม่นอาจจะเป็นพื้นฐานอันดีอันนึงซึ่งว่าจะมีการส่งเสริมเศรษฐกิจจุลภาคส่งเสริมเศรษฐกิจครัวเรือนเฮ็ดให้พื้นฐานเศรษฐกิจมีความเข้มแข็งเนาะข้าพเจ้าหวังว่ากองประชุมสัมมนาวิทยาศาสตร์ในครั้งนี้จะนำผลประโยชน์บ่หลายก็น้อยมาให้แก่นักสัมมนากรและอีกทีนึงข้าพเจ้าก็อยากแสดงความขอบใจที่พวกท่านได้เข้าร่วมและหวังว่าในครั้งต่อไปพวกเราจะได้พบกันอีกและย้ำอีกทีนึงแม่นอยากให้พวกท่านได้ลงทะเบียนเพราะว่าพวกเราได้กากเกี่ยมใบยั่งยืนการเข้าร่วมเป็น Certificate ของร่วมระหว่างมูลนิธิฮันไซเดนและสถาบันวิทยาศาสตร์เศรษฐกิจสังคมของพวกเราเนาะพวกเราคิดว่าตามแผนถ้าบ่มีหยังเปลี่ยนแปลงกันต้องสืบต่ออีก7ครั้งจึงที่สำเร็จสุดสัมมนาวิทยาศาสตร์เกี่ยวกับเศรษฐกิจตลาดสังคมเนาะซึ่งว่าถ้าหากว่าอยู่ในระยะการดำเนินกองประชุมพวกเขาหากมีหัวข้อใหม่เกิดขึ้นหัวข้อที่สำคัญที่พวกท่านเสนอหรือว่าฝ่ายลาวพวกเขามีหัวข้อค้นคว้าที่อยากเอามาเสนอที่กองประชุมพวกเขาก็ยินดีขยายเวลาออกไปเนาะฉะนั้นไทยนี่ก็บ่มีหยังแล้วข้าพเจ้าในนามคณะจัดตั้งอีกเทื่อนึงแสดงความขอบใจต่อบรรดาท่านนักสัมมนากรที่เข้าร่วมกองประชุมขอบใจนำกองทุนฮันไซเดนมูลนิธิฮันไซเดนที่ให้การสนับสนุนและพิเศษขอบใจนำท่านศาสตราจารย์ดร.แห่ที่ได้ให้ข้อมูลเกี่ยวกับระบบการเงินและระบบสินเชื่อเพื่อการพัฒนาเศรษฐกิจของสหภาพเยอรมันข้าพเจ้าขอปิดกองประชุมอย่างเป็นทางการขอขอบใจ
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Bye bye. Thank you, Professor.
Bye bye.
See you next time.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
Bye bye.